Okay, so I guess I'll just get started. The whole goal, I guess, for today is to provide a little bit of background, a little bit of context um, to the Republic and to this book. So we'll be going over Plato, this like Greek philosopher, his teacher, Socrates, like the most famous guy in philosophy, probably. And then maybe just like a bit about his life and the main themes of the book, how the book is structured, and all that type of stuff. So, what we know about Aristotle, most of it comes from Laertius and then other historians of the time, but there are fuzzy periods in his life that we just don't know too much about. Even his exact date of birth is a little bit fuzzy. There's debate on whether or not it was in the 428 or 427 BCE, but it was around that time, right? Around 420s BC. He was this Greek philosopher and probably like the father of philosophy, and that's widely accepted. The father of Western philosophy, at least. Everything is divided basically in Western philosophy from the Socratic period, where Socrates is teacher, um, to the pre-Socratic, everything before that, and then the Socratic, everything after that. And then you can get into like Platonism and Neoplatonism and all that. But there was like a big divide at this point between Socrates, his Plato's teacher, and everything else, right? It was like a big turning point. Plato himself came from a relatively well-off family, an aristocratic family. They were all pretty educated, likely. Um, and they were well known. They weren't like Socrates, who was a bit like lesser known, less rich. They were of decent money. They were like in pretty good social standing at the time. As he was growing up, as Plato was growing up, he came across Socrates, a guy who would just go around the town of Athens and pester people. He would basically just enter into conversation with individuals and in one way or another prove that or lead them to realize that they don't know as much as they think. So this influenced and impacted Plato a lot in his writings and in everything he speaks about after. There's nothing we actually have directly from Socrates. He never wrote down anything. He doesn't have any like physical texts we can look at. He was completely about dialogue, right? He would just speak, and he thought that that's how philosophy should be done. We only know of him because Plato writes a lot about him and uses him as one of the characters in his book. Whether or not this character in the book named Socrates reflects exactly who Socrates was is a little bit up for debate, but it's pretty commonly agreed upon that this is very similar. This character of Socrates was very similar of the actual Socrates that existed at the time. Socrates, the teacher, he was put to death in Athens on charges of impiety, on like being a dick to the gods apparently, on corrupting the youth, on making the youth think too much. And a lot of people didn't like that. A lot of statesmen didn't like that. So it was put up to a vote on whether or not they should put this guy Socrates, who claimed to know nothing and who just liked talking and yapping away. They put it up to a vote, and in a very slight majority, they favored his death. So they put him on trial, and that's one of the chapters, the apology, that you can read of Plato. But they put him on trial. They make him drink some hemlock, some like poison, and then that's where Socrates ended. This is actually my sister's old room. I don't know if you're saying that to me or someone else, but yeah. So Socrates was put to death. He was put on trial on charges of impiety, on corrupting the youth, and that marked Plato pretty significantly. Plato ended up traveling around for 12-ish years after this. It's a little bit fuzzy this point in his life what ended up happening. He went to Egypt, probably, possibly India, Italy, and just places around the Mediterranean. He learned and took a lot from the Pythagoreans at the time, this other like group of philosophers, basically. And he went on to write a lot of his books during this time. A couple of things to kind of understand for the context in which this book was written. This was like in the later phases of the like a golden period in Athens, right? and there was this war going on at the time called the Peloponnesian Wars, and it was between the state of Sparta and the state of Athens. So obviously, there was a lot of like friction and conflict in uh, the ruling class and how the military operated in social standings and all this type of stuff. And obviously, we see echoes of that in this book. Another important thing to keep in mind is that during a little bit after these Peloponnesian Wars, Athens was defeated by the Spartans, and then there came a time called I think it was something like the 30 Tyrants, the rule of the 30 Tyrants, where 30 individuals, 30 powerful individuals, took charge of the state, um, and then afterwards, a little bit, democracy was restored. Let's see, what else do I have to say about the general state of affairs? Um, yeah, so for the reasons, Plato was a little bit upset at democracy because his master, his leader Socrates, he was put to death because of a democratic vote or democratic-ish vote. It was because the majority of people agreed on something, and that was what was deemed to be correct. So he didn't like this idea of the majority rule for a lot of things we'll go over, because he thought the majority of people weren't very educated, the majority of people could be persuaded and manipulated, the majority of people were driven by interests that he didn't think should be the interests of a good person. They were driven by things like wealth and status, which he didn't like that much. He came from a father named Ariston, who he claimed that he thought that his descendants were from Poseidon. Funny enough, so there was a bit of a big head on the father's shoulders, possibly, and maybe we hear a little bit about that, or maybe we sense a little bit about that the way Plato speaks about philosophers and how he should be viewed and how they should be viewed. He had two brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, uh, also interlocutors, right? He also kind of made them turn them into characters in this book. Um, and then his mother was likely or maybe had some sort of connections with this lawmaker named Solon, who was a pretty big figure in pre-Socratic philosophy. So he was a somewhat famous guy. People knew of him. And that's, I guess, the only type of context that you really need to know if this is the first time you're reading this. Um, Other than that, it's more about, like, I just want to talk about the themes or the stuff that you go over in this book. Just by reading the first book, the first chapter, you get a pretty good overview of all of the themes that are going to be touched upon in this book. The most important of which probably is the theme of justice, of what constitutes a just society. The whole project of the Republic of this book is to figure out how we can create a utopic society, the best possible society, because oligarchies aren't really working, aristocracies aren't really working, democracies put his teacher to death. So Plato wants to figure out how the heck can we create a just society that works, that doesn't have all the issues that it currently has. So justice, what constitutes a just society, is at the center of it. Other things that he speaks of in this book is just what if things like the nature of the soul, right? So he talks a lot about this thing called the tripartite soul, on how we as people are built up. He also talks about the allegory of the cave a lot, which is something you'll probably run into in intro to philosophy classes. And then at the end of the book, kind of, he comes up with a conclusion or with a full understanding or a full uh, proposal for how to rule this utopic society, which is with the philosopher king. He thinks that philosophers, or the people who are the wisest, the most just, the most good, what he calls a philosopher, this should be these people that are ruling, not other people. And I guess that's the only thing I have to say. I know a couple of you have probably read the book again, so since there are a lot of holes in the things I said, or a lot of things that I probably missed, step in, please, and talk about that if you'd like.
First of all, isn't your camera open, Chris? I don't see your picture.
It should be.
I,
I
I
see it.
just see Henry. I just see Henry. Yeah, I just see Henry, and Henry's room is, so cool. But yeah. Anyways, you did a lot of good overview on the history of him, and I just wanted to say that are we going to read it line by line, or just overall review of the book?
I think what we're gonna do is section up each meeting with one or two books, or one or three books, depending on how meaty each book is. Next time we'll probably, or even today, we can start getting into the the scene and the setting of book one and what he talks about. But yeah, I think we'll just do a couple of books or a couple of chapters. A couple of chapters
Right.
every
You know, because I think that if we are going to, slowly progress, it will take a while. That's why I suggested to you that if we could do some, more sessions each week, we would probably progress faster on the book.
day.
And also, I wanted to say that if we increase the number of sessions per week, we can probably do some more cool stuff, like, critiquing or talking about some profound and high rated movies that have philosophical themes, or, you know, some deep concepts in them. That would be a pretty cool side project for the book club. What do you think?
You guys are
I
more than
wanted to know.
welcome to, gather amongst yourselves or like even like set up your own meetings with each other. But like time wise, I'm not sure if
Mhm.
I can do another book club a week. I'm a tiny bit busy with stuff. But you guys are more than welcome.
Right. Okay, and lastly, I wanted to express my, remorse that we didn't go with Heraclitus' book, because, it's pretty, fragmented. It's called the fragments, and we can talk about each fragment. It would be very cool, But this book is coherent. It's, more extensive and more long, so it would be different from that, very different. I would like to go over that, if you
Yeah,
agree, you all guys agree. Yeah.
there is a lot of pre-Socratic things we could talk about to give us some like overview or to like build up to the Republic and where it's gonna be. But that's not my
Yeah.
I'm not very well read on pre-Socratic things. I've only taken a couple courses on it. My whole
Right.
thing is Plato
Uh-huh.
classics. I'm a lot more familiar with that stuff. But yeah, it would have been cool.
Right. You know that Plato have write a book in the name of Parmenides, actually, but he talks about the idea of Heraclitus in his other books too. In the he actually uh, puts the I puts it in the mouth of Socrates. So that Socrates have read his work
Hmm.
and didn't understand it completely, but he have gained a lot of insight from reading it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I guess to
so
open
yeah, I'm gonna step up,
cool,
and
yeah,
other talk. Yeah.
for sure. So I guess just to like open it up a tiny bit in proper Socratic fashion. And for I guess anyone who isn't totally familiar, Socratic fashion or Socratic dialogue is basically like, okay, between me and you or me and a couple people or like a group of people, let's try and come to an understanding of something, right? Let's try and define something. So we start with an initial definition, something like what is justice? And then we try and come up with counterexamples, right? Or try and disprove our previous definition. And then eventually through dialogue we'll come to a lot, like something a lot closer to what justice actually might be. So just without reading the book or without having any like arguments already baked into your head from what Plato might be talking about in this book, what does it mean? What is justice? What does it mean to be just?
Mm, it's about the thesis and antithesis and synthesis of those all of it, but we cannot start, right by that simply expressing it. It will actually lead to some of
Okay,
the
so thesis, let's
actually.
put that aside from all this philosophical lingo, in layman's terms, in just general
Okay,
speaking, like what does it mean to be just?
all right. To not demolish people's rights. That's a good start.
Okay, to not demolish people's right. Can someone interject?
I think we can go even more generally speaking to say um, to have balance or equity.
Have balance or equity, like among a population?
I guess it's kind of hard to say, but yeah, we can say among the population to instill that. How, I'm not sure. It's pretty big.
Okay, so let's go with that then. What is just is or should be the balance or equity among people, something like that.
The rights differ. The definitions of them differ from time to time in societies. Sometimes, people thought that sexual orientation isn't a thing that people can define for themselves, and it's a fixed thing. And if anyone deviates from that, is a sinner and should be put to, punishment. But now it has changed. That's an example. So yeah,
Yes.
the very definition of what is
Yeah.
one person's right
What's just can move throughout time,
changing.
right? What's just at time one, or what was just 100 years
Yeah,
ago, no longer just now. If we're going with that definition,
that's
we need to admit that justice is relative. And I don't think that's anyone's notion of what justice is. Justice should not be relative. It should be something that is completely right or wrong, oughful and not oughful in a society.
Think that at least again, like I haven't read this book, but in most other like dialogues of definition, the way that um the meanings end up getting resolved, or like some of the most common ways that Socrates critiques the meanings that are presented by like the other person he's engaging in a conversation with, is because it doesn't meet like like certain requirements like within time and stuff like that. And I think I want to say in the Phaedo, I might be completely wrong, I might be in the Meno, but there's like this like broad discussion of kind of like what is like justness like in or outside of like the city walls, I think is kind of the thing. And I believe that Socrates ends up critiquing the person that he's like speaking to and saying that like you know what is like right cannot just be like determined by kind of like conventions. It's like nomos versus phusis or whatever. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, but anyways, I think that you're right, Chris, is that like he would say that like that, a definition of justice, like necessarily one that cuts across time and like cultures and like isn't relative, right? Like Socrates is interested in like what concepts are themselves, like what goodness itself is, what badness itself is, what justness itself is. It wouldn't be something that would be limited temporally.
May I raise a bit
The
uh, a, a dilemma because uh, I was just thinking about it. That is there can is it something that is justice without without putting some words to it, that it's inherently justice, that has that kind of potency, that attributes and that virtues, but it doesn't need to be named justice, but it preserves what justice is.
I think the bottom line here is that either you take the side of the Sufists that try to be relativistic, like Protagoras, and you let go of the very hard trying to define things, or you can try a futile try to define. That's the very theme that's recurring in Plato's works, as Socrates questions and tries to go to a core concept, a concrete, non-changing, and true definition of these values, but he fails. So, and we can refer to Aristotle too. That was very that puts very emphasis on the civilization and the city, and that the human is a political being, and if he's outside the political and civilized system, he is no longer a human as we know it. So it's going back to the point that it's all social contracts, it's all uh, culture, pretty much it's that. And if a person is able to have the power or the right, either it was given to him by law, or it's a thing that he have given himself with the power that he have, or with influence that he have, then he can think about the definitions and define concepts, etc., etc. But if he's unable to, or doesn't have the means to define and claim his rights, then we cannot talk about justice with him, because he can't impose the rights that he demands. So talking about justice
Oh, come on. No.
or they have dress codes in public, and whether or not they believe it, they have to abide to it. So that's a point that I wanted to actually illustrate here. So I would like to hear your insights too about it.
But I think that justice doesn't necessarily need to be intertwined with right or wrong. Justice is another thing on it itself. You don't need to to mix it up with right, with freedom, with anything on its bare thing. Justice is as Chris has said, usually interpreted as very relative thing, because what is justice for me is not justice for another human being. For example, if I slap you, that's justice for me, but that's injustice for you. There is not right or wrong here. The idea is what is just. How is this a just act, and what makes this act a just act?
Yeah, I think you're onto something
Right. And in this,
good there, Peter, because we shouldn't be conflating different, or we should try and limit how much we conflate different ideas together. We should try and separate a little bit how much social contract stuff can interact with just stuff. We should like try and set these things apart, right? Because once we start mixing them up, we don't make very much progress. So justice as its own thing, as a property or as a thing in itself, I want to figure out what that is.
we have started off by talking about not demolishing people's rights. Okay, so that's why we were, erring to the side of political rights and stuff like that. But you're right, and in this book, in Republic, Plato actually makes some relativistic remarks. He actually talks about uh, an evil thing that a powerful person does is good for him, but not good for the weak that is subject to those evil stuff. So that's one thing, and it's all it's all instinctual. In core, human beings are actually biological entity that are living and trying to define things, but in its core instinct, because the need to be safe, need to be appreciated, or validation. These all contribute to the defining and definitions that people actually uh, uh, make for themselves, for the society that they live in, and then it becomes a unknown quest to define what the actual ideal, or the Plato is actually an idealist. The actually core thing that this word is actually an impression of it. The true thing, the model for everything that is present here. But that's a futile try. It's not definable. It's empty
I
in
think
it.
Mr. Fufu,
We talk about the actual.
yeah, I think Mr. Fufu made a good remark in the comments here. Can we separate or differentiate right from wrong, or just from right or ought, like justness from rightness or wrongness? How can we do that? How could we try and do that?
Mm, it's we can try to say this by examples. For instance, you may think that the enemy in a battlefield is wrong, okay, but then you see him that is injured, okay, and he is not able to defend himself. Then you go and put some band-aids on his wound, and that seems just, but it's not right in your opinion. You know what I'm saying? It's some sort of uh, hermit thinking, and being free from these ideas, and seeing it from outside, like a third person. That person is wounded and is lying there, so it's just to help him. It's good to appreciate his right to live, even though he is a person who is an enemy to me by his political or uh, military acts. Yeah.
I mean, I don't really know. Would you really call that just? I mean, I guess you need more context. Like, if that soldier has killed hundreds and hundreds of people, hundreds of your friends, is it then just to go up and save that person who's injured? Or, I don't know, I guess in my mind, justice would be more kind of a equal. Like if you do something bad, for example, you get an equally bad punishment as a result to someone. That would be kind of my way of thinking about it. But I don't know. For me, it always comes back to the issue of, can we really define anything? I mean, I kind of struggle with that. I struggle to find a way to say if anything is perfectly just or if anything is right without anything to say that it is, like the existence of a god. I mean, it's always something I've kind of struggled with, is creating that kind of secular idea of objective morality. And I think it kind of comes back to that, because if we assume that we can say things are definite, then you can create some kind of definition, but otherwise I think the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Plato, I
I
mean,
think the
Plato would
sorry, go for it.
Right.
I think that like Plato would say that like there is a god, not like a god, there are like there are gods, and like in his like understanding of the universe, right, like he believes in a soul. And so between both Plato and Aristotle, they think that actions, like like there's the big question that is like, is it more harmful to do wrong than it is, or is it more harmful to like incur wrong, right? Like, is it more wrong for you to do an unjust act, or is it more like worse? Is it more painful? Is it like more damaging to commit an unjust act, or to be the recipient of one? And so and this like question that's like kind of like mirrored in like a few different dialogues in a few different places. But I think ultimately, like, what the conclusion kind of ends up being is that when you act badly, you are like incurring a harm against your own soul. And like that is where like kind of the root of the badness comes from. And also, like, I think that the explanation of the soul for Plato um uh does a good job of kind of like mediating, is like like not needing necessarily like perfection or for things to be just, but kind of like there is a, I don't want to say like natural order of things, but there is a natural way of being that like balances out kind of goodness and badness within relation to like humans because of the soul. Because the soul is this like different like ordered thing. And so yeah, I mean like there's like I think there are questions of like, you know, his relation to kind of like a conception of a god, but yeah, he would kind of say that that's where you know, if you're doing something wrong, like where like justness and unjust kind of like take traits would be like within the soul.
I agree with you, but there is still just things that are right and just things that are not right. There are right things that are just, and there are wrong things that are just as well.
What
I
would be
don't
a wrong thing
so I
that's
think
just?
but wait, justness is this is I think this is important to Chris's point earlier. Justness is like different than right or wrong, right? Like you can say that if something is right, then it like ought to be just, or that like, you know, rightness like entails some sort of justness, but just because it is just doesn't mean it is right. And so like it would be just for the person who does a bad act to incur harms as a result of the act on their soul. That is justness. That's not necessarily like rightness, but that is the just order of the world. And I also think that their difference, yeah, I think their difference can also probably be like explained in like other ways. And that's not to say that these things aren't related, right? Because also like you would probably have to incorporate a question of piety into this, which is like, you know, in the Euthyphro, right? Like one of the first questions or one of the first definitions that they discuss is the idea that what is pious is like, you know, like justness to the gods or something like that. And so you know, all of these terms kind of like they can have co-constitutive like parts, or they can have things that like entail one another, but I think it's really important to keep them like discrete. And while you know an action can have multiple traits, there are some traits that you just wouldn't describe an action as being, like in Plato's like canon, because it doesn't meet like the requirements for the other definition.
The actual, actually Plato have two different and opposing ideas. First, he, as you said, he's referring to the God and the rule of, incurring harm to yourself if you are doing evil. And that's a divinely defined thing as wrong, as evil, and is, going to have the consequence to be punished rightfully. The state have to punish you if you do that. But at the same time, at one of his other books, I think, he says that if you do a bad thing to an evil person, he will become more bad and more evil. So you won't cure his evilness, but you will make him more bad. So
True. I don't think it's
referring to the
part of the thing that when you do an unjust act, part of the way that you like receive like indication that it is unjust is that like the state of your soul is hurt. And so while like Aristotle might say that that would kind of like push you farther into a decline, right? Because Aristotle thinks that there's a that you know like virtue is like an arete, that's something that needs to be like more skilled, and like when you in order to reach eudaimonia, you have to do good acts and be a good person, right? So like while that like under Aristotle's view that might make someone more wicked, but I don't necessarily think that that's true under Plato's view, and I don't know if that like same like analogy would hold. I think that the way that you get punished is that there's kind of like an intrinsic punishment that happens within the soul when you do something unjust, and also like
right.
you know that you're differing from the natural order, right? It is the natural order of man to act justly and like or to act like rightly or to act you know in virtuous ways, and so in order to kind of like stray from that like you know natural path of the soul, there has to be like other I guess like corruptions that take place, but it's still like in our nature to do good. So it's like we're still like looking to do good.
Yeah, there's a couple
Right.
of assumptions we need to keep
You
when we're reading
know,
Plato or any of the classics. It's assumed that we have soul, and it's
oh,
assumed that they strive for rightness or correctness or virtue or things like that. Like that's odd. That's a given. Same thing with it's a given that there are gods that will punish or not punish. That's a given, right? So we know like that needs to be like all in the background and understood. We can debate about whether or not those assumptions are true or not, But for the sake of engaging with classical literature, like these classics, we do need to just like lay that foundation down and be like, if we want to engage with this text, we need to assume that there is a soul. We need to assume that this soul strives for something proper and good, and we need to assume that people can be correctable, like all the things that we talk about in the book. But yeah, I just wanted to quickly pop that in there. Like those are the assumptions that we're going with.
That's the hermeneutic discussion, you know. Yeah, and I wanted to say that, you know, as an example, um, or as an illustration of this fact that people in a society assume act contemptible and punishable. Okay, so they define punishments in the law for it. Okay, but actually it doesn't matter if a person who is a danger to society is put to jail or is put to death, or you know, just is confined or is put away or cast away. You know, I was trying to highlight this, that uh, in Plato's view, which is a communistic view, actually, in his political utopia.
Here, I think that's. I want to correct something that you said though, because I think that's definitely untrue. Like the idea that. Yeah, okay. First of all, I don't think it's like a communistic view. So, like the utopian socialists did draw inspiration from like part of Plato's Republic and like part of Plato's Utopia, right? But I definitely would not call it a communist view, especially because this is like the Republic, right? Like this is defining something that is different than a democracy insofar as representation gets watered down to the level of having one like person who represents a group of people. So, like very clearly, this is not a communist view. A communist view would be
Well,
like egalitarianism, yes, but we should differentiate egalitarianism from just like communism without,
they actually live together in a commune, you know. That's the idea that Plato puts, and the people should, you know,
Yeah, but
the
that's not
children should be raised
communism.
by the state.
You live in a community.
that's the same definition as you would give any state then the United States is a commune because we all live together, like, you know what I mean? Like, no, like clearly those
In
things are
that way.
there's a very technical definition for like, like what
The best
communism
communist state.
just like the
Yeah.
Republic blatantly does not meet.
It actually is a totalitarian view, because they want to take the children from people. You know, they are so sure in their rightfulness that they actually allow themselves or consider themselves entitled to
But
take the
that's not
children away from society.
totalitarianism.
I just want to
Totalitarian.
interject here quickly. I think you might be misreading or misunderstanding a lot of the points in this book, because by no means is it anywhere close to a totalitarianism or or a type of communism. So maybe some like supplementary reading or like some lectures or something, 'cause that is a little bit off base from what the Republic is kind of aiming at. I just wanted to quickly say that.
Not
Just
in the
one quick point, if I
Republic
can.
itself.
Uh, Totalitarianism cannot exist without the ability to totally subject your subjects. That means that totalitarianism can only exist after the invention of the mass medias.
You know, in the canon, as he aged, as Plato aged, he actually became more,
I think we should differentiate
you know,
between
became more rigid.
or like a
Actually,
kingship, right? When you're talking like the philosopher king, right? Like we should differentiate that between like totalitarianism, communism, authoritarianism, all of those things, right? Like those conceptions of government don't exist to scale yet. And so I just think it's like very important that like he was not thinking in a modern context, right? Like it was like either you had a monarchy, you had like a king, you had an emperor, you had one person ruling, or it was like some sort of like representative democracy. And like, obviously with like some things falling in between, but I just think it's like I think most classicists would also agree with me here. Like I would really warn against trying to use modern language to describe some of these ancient texts. Right? Like it would be like the same thing as if someone was like, oh, well, like, like Socrates and like Aristotle were like pedophiles because
well, we don't have any language other than this, you know. We have one language. I don't know what word to use.
we have the language of the Platonic canon, we have the language of the text. right? So it's like when we start kind of applying our own vocabulary that again like has like modern usages that's almost like I would akin to like a term of art where it's referencing something very specific. The same way we should talk about like we should talk about Plato and the language of Plato, which is the language of the text, language of the translations, and also like our understanding of that history at the time and like the dynamics that play there.
So, Chris, should we go into the text yet, or do we have to discuss it more? I think it's
Sure.
enough,
I'm gonna open
So
up. I'm
can
gonna
we
open
go
up
into
the
it?
scene. Sure, I'll open up the scene at book one, and the way all of this starts off. So, the Republic is it's a constant dialogue between Socrates, the main character, right, the teacher of Plato, and a lot of interlocutors, right, Glaucon, Cephalus, and we'll go on and we'll start meeting all of them. But the way it totally opens up or starts off is that Socrates and a friend are they're coming back or they are at this like type of ritual or rite, worshiping a god, right? It's a social event. It's pretty low order. It's just like for the common people. It's relaxed, and it's just two of them, right? And something very important to note is that as they're trying to leave this area or this scene, they get stopped by someone's servant or someone's slave. Hold up, we want someone, like someone wants to see you. Come back, wait up with us. And already there, you get a little bit of a feeling of uh, being stopped in doing something you want to do because it's a little bit clear in the first few lines that Socrates and his friend don't really want to listen to this person or go to this other person's house. They want to just go on, get on their way and do their own thing. But what ends up happening is that there's more people with the slave person. So that's a bit like foreshadowing, like the majority is kind of making the decisions for people, right? A democracy. There's a lot of people around, and only Socrates and who was it, Glaucon, or the friend that he's with at the time. And that was where book one sets off. Then they go to another older man's house, right? And they might not want to be there as much, but Socrates will still entertain. He will still entertain this old man and give him the opportunity to to present his case on why he wanted Socrates to be summoned. He was saying you should be visiting me more often. I'm getting old. I can't go out of the house to see you. Come hang out with me and talk. He speaks about how important conversation is at that age. And so Socrates, he agrees to some extent. He says, yes, you're right. Dialogue and conversation is very important. Let's start talking. So they all start talking. A bunch of people start talking, and they try and define or get to some sort of definition of what justice is, right? And that's kind of where it opened up and where I wanted to start off this whole discussion. In our own fashion, let's figure out what justice is. But if we're just going to stick to the text now, which I think we should, um, let's take a look at what they originally considered justice to be. Let's see. As concerning justice, what is it? Pardon me?
They discussed something about the decline of sexual faculty in an old man at that part of the book, and they consider it a good thing as a gift of being old, to be released from the urge to have sex. So that was a notable thing because Schopenhauer actually refers to this thing a lot because he's anti
Yeah, well, let's try and
body.
stick to the stuff back here in time. Try and stick to this stuff.
Okay.
I think something that's interesting about that though is that Plato's really concerned with ability, and so like his conceptions of goodness and like badness often like regard ability as like taking apart, and so he thinks that and like Aristotle too, right? Like thinks that Aristotle is like a line about how like even the most like even a slave can achieve like excellence and like virtue, and that's because like the things that you need to do virtue aren't like hinged on some like material ability to do things, but rather they're like kind of found within like unlocking parts of the soul and like doing recollection and stuff like that, which is like what Plato thinks learning is. And so yeah, it's like I think that's like a really interesting point, which is that um ability kind of plays a theme throughout Plato's work. At least like that's what I read into it. So maybe we can find that in the Republic
Right.
too.
I wanted to say my kind of own definition of justice with an example, because if you think about the justice as some absolutely defined and articulate
Justice,
way.
though. I think I like that one.
Uh-huh. Okay. Then we're
I
not
think
seeing the big.
we're not. Again, I think that Plato probably sees more of the big picture than any of us. I really think we
Okay.
should
Okay.
just to talk about him.
Okay. I'm not talking about anybody uh, in a specific. I'm just saying
But it's
that
like
in one
Plato has to say.
series. Let me talk a little, then you go on. So I wanted to say that in one series that I saw years later, there was this baby, this toddler who was not able to understand right or wrong. Okay, so he would go on and kill people and birds and
Okay,
creatures,
I really don't think.
and they actually killed and they killed him. Okay, because as they knew he was not aware of his intentions and wasn't actually aware of right or wrong as is generally defined between people.
Okay. Sorry guys, that was a little too tangential for my liking. Um, I'd rather talk about the book because this is a book club. I don't mean to be rude or anything, but yeah. I would just like to stick to the content, or like to the book itself. I guess moving past that, getting like to where were we at in the little explanation of book one, is that they're talking with this older man, about what justice is. And they start off originally. It's well said, Cephalus, I replied. But as concerning justice, what is it? This is the first kind of hint of like a definition. Um, to speak the truth and to pay your debts. So it's about paying off debts and speaking truth. And then they come up with a bunch of like rebuttals. It's like, okay, in what context? What do you mean repay debts? Can the rich man always be just because he can always repay his debts? Okay, maybe not. Maybe that definition doesn't really work. Let's come up with a better one. And they keep on doing this over and over and over. That's just like a perfect example of this Socratic dialogue, this type of like uh, talking with each other, coming to know of truths through discussion. So, leaving it there, do you guys want to talk about something related to the book?
Um, I mean, yeah, I could also just like mention the ability thing again. So like I think it's really interesting that like the first definition they discuss is like just because someone can do something that is just, like does that make them just? And that's kind of like what I again like a very common theme that I find to be like the core at a lot of these like dialogues of definition. And that's kind of like how the like elenchus gets employed, right? It gets used to try to like get closer to like resolving like the truth, but also he repeats a lot of themes.
Henry, did you read any of it at all? You get started with it?
I should have, but I didn't. Well, I wanted to. I have the edition that I have is like
No,
I have like
I
a
was asking Henry, sorry.
oh no, you're good.
I actually misheard who you said, so I didn't think you were talking to me. But I read the introduction, so I've got a very nice copy here, which has a little introduction, which kind of outlined the main ideas. So I haven't started it yet, but I think I've kind of got a bit of a grasp, like an overview of kind of what it talks about. I'm very excited to get into it though. I haven't started it. Although I did read like a few pages a while back. Something I did, but no, haven't started it. Just read an introduction. It was really interesting.
Sweet. Peter, what did you think about book one as a whole, if you've read it?
Finally found my notes in the book. Finally, I was searching for them all evening today. Like because I read it, but I read it a long time, and the discussions there, the debates, they are really thought provoking, and it really needs someone to read them multiple times. But I forgot your question. I was absolutely happy that they found my notes. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, what did you think about book one? Like there, yeah, do you think it was an appropriate introduction to this book? Because I know you were saying that it is a complicated book, and to some extent I do agree. You can get really in depth, line by line, and person by person. And you can yeah, you can turn this 200-page book into an absolute Bible if you want to. But just off of impressions of book one, what did you think about it? Do you think it was an appropriate introduction to the rest of the meat in this book?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't think so because, for example, I, I just saw in my notes that we completely missed in the speaking about justice. We missed what Plato wanted to prove with his issue there. Whether the main question what Plato wanted to ask was in the dialogue with Glaucon, I think, whether just man means a happy man. Does just man makes a happy man, and does injustice makes a just man unhappy? That's from where he went on. Uh, it said that if injustice, then just man is unhappy, and then if then injustice happens, then unjust man is happy. So for him is everything is about the. I think Lil also said that it's about his the human inner satisfaction from the fruit of the action, something around those lines.
Yeah, I think it's very important to note that the soul is reflective of a just society. If you can have a soul that's in harmony, if you can have a soul that's working just fine, then necessarily you're going to have this nice society that works out and it's fine. The issue is that in most men the soul is not in harmony, and in most men those who are in power have a soul who is not in harmony, or which is not in harmony. So I think
Wait,
that
and I'm
makes
gonna
it.
can I say
Yeah, go.
like so part of again I'm going back to ability a lot, but I've been reading a lot of essays on it, and so it's like part of the thing that makes the men in power like uniquely kind of have this imbalance of the soul. Like one of them is that they have the ability to indulge their every whim, and so like that's kind of like what Plato describes as uh like the tyrant, right, in the Gorgias. And so he's like the tyrant is bad because the tyrant is actually able to indulge every like desire they have, or everyone but the soul, and that's like damaging to themselves. It's damaging to their soul because they have the material means to, where there are some people who are limited in their material means, and those people are actually unable to do that, like that same harm to their soul, because they can't indulge it in the same way.
Yeah, and that gets to his point of why there should be philosopher kings, because those people in power wouldn't want to or need to indulge in all of these worldly pleasures or corrupting tendencies. And they wouldn't even want to be in power too. It's a thing. Most of the time, it's the people who are corruptible and who strive for these material desires that end up in power because they're just trying to climb up there. And that was his point almost to why this aristocracy wasn't working out, because it was the aristocrats, it was the people in power that had the biggest desires, and that's why they got into those positions of power. He thinks that the people who don't want it, but who have cultivated their souls beautifully, a philosopher, it should be these people that should be calling the shots and making the decisions because they're not as corruptible as the tyrants that are in power.
I had a question about when I was reading the introduction. It kind of gave this brief overview of we've got these philosopher kings who don't want to rule, but they're kind of being asked to almost. But does Plato kind of see this to be a realistic goal? Because it seems very tightly controlled, or almost tightly manufactured. Because to actually get to this level of society, you'd have to spend years and years kind of conditioning people, surely. Because to condition out of people the desire for worldly things is a difficult thing to do. So how realistic was this goal of Plato or Socrates or whatever?
I think
Zero.
that I was gonna say, I think that part of what Ilya got right earlier was just that he is an idealist, right? And I think it's like we should understand this as kind of being some form of ideal theory. I think that in the context of Athens, while it was the biggest society, largest society at the time or whatever, um it wasn't as I guess fractured as modern day. So I don't know, it might have seemed like a more surmountable task then, but also it is still dealing in ideal theory.
Yes, and to top that off, Plato had his own forms, his own universe of perfect things, and that's where uh, he puts this society in his unreachable, unrealistic yet perfect things in the forms.
As we'll keep reading in the book, and that, you hit the nail on the head with that question, because that's the number one thing that should come to mind when he presents us with this idea of philosopher king. Hey, hold on a second, you're a philosopher and you want to be a king? It's what's going on here? You need to indoctrinate an entire population to get them to understand that. One one thing he would focus on, or probably say, would be that this whole project would require a huge amount of education, of moral and virtuous education, of teaching children from a young age, um, to not completely succumb to immediate desires, to seek for higher virtuous things, and then over time, maybe the society would get better and better, better, and so on. But education would probably be one of the pillars if you were to create this ideal republic. Another one of the pillars that we'll get into, the following books talk about all this stuff. But another one of the pillars would be, even in this society, if you want to enforce things, you need a type of enforcer, a guard. And these guards or these soldiers need to in themselves be indoctrinated in a separate but similar way. If they want to protect the greater good of this republic, of the society, they need to be trained and be willing to fight for it, because there will be opposing states that want to walk in and own things, just like what was happening with Sparta and Athens at the time. He wasn't naive to think that he could just come up with a state without any protection. So he would need a lot of education and then a lot of guards or ways to protect this utopia to be grown into. Yeah, but that was a nail on the head. That's exactly what the questions he probably wants you to be asking.
Our guy was probably right. It is like a communism, but it's just one thing that it's unreachable.
Yeah, it was a communism, but I'm just pretty sure he was speaking about it in modern terms, or conflating a lot of things.
Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
And obviously he wants to indoctrinate, and through education is his whole kind of point behind it, that he's using reason, and this is the most just thing to do. Therefore, even if people don't want to be educated in this way, it's still the most just thing to do. So we should therefore still do it, because how do you decide why it should be? And yeah, from the introduction, it was kind of placing reason above all, and this is the most reasoned way to do things. But still, I mean, I guess how do you decide that this is the right way to run your society, and then go through this process?
Yeah, so his whole revelation, his big idea, his big thing was that it is through reason, right, that we can come to understand these truths and teach other people about certain truths. And the reason resides within the soul, right? Reason has always existed, just like the soul has always existed for Plato. It's some sort of eternal thing. So if we can have a healthy soul, we can access proper reasoning, and then that reasoning will allow us all the time and perfectly, if we have a perfect soul, to make the right decisions and to implement the correct laws in any situation where a child might not want to be taught something, but we should still force them a little bit to learn. The same way that kids might not want to sit down and do math for a couple hours every day, it's probably best for us to just kind of force them and teach them English and basic mathematics and stay in school and this type of stuff. It's it's not perfect, but if we have perfect reason, we can get to a perfect result, which is this utopia or this.
Good for the soul, and when you have this conception of the soul as just needing to be nourished to reach its full potential, whatever, if you can conceptualize that as kind of being the goodness that he talks about, then it's yeah, if you make everyone desire the right things, and you will have only good people in society, and that makes it easier. So it's kind of like baked in. It's just like if we do this, then like they just become naturally good people.
Yes, and I believe that throughout his life, Socrates or the character of Socrates by Plato, he's searching for the absolute things, and in a way, this republic is an absolute good society that he can come up with, and even in the discussion about love in one of the texts, I forgot which name was, and then about God, about justice, about everything. He's searching for that absolute things. The in a way, what he puts in the formal universe.
Yeah, formal universes and like the material universe, right?
I misspelled. It's forms.
Oh,
Universe of forms. Sorry, not formal forms.
Forms lack substance. That's also like part of their definition. At least that's what. Yeah.
I mean, often he's recognized as the one who began to think in a duality, in dual sense, that there is something beyond. Quite complex book.
yeah, it has a lot of content. I wouldn't say it's very complex. A lot of the ideas are pretty straightforward and easy to understand, especially if it's the first time you're reading it. Obviously, if you read it 2 or 3 or 4 times, you're going to pick up on a ton more stuff. But it's very digestible. The only thing is that there's a lot of it, right? There's a lot of topics and points being made. So for that reason, yeah, it is pretty difficult to chew on. But I think what we should do is I need to rock and roll right now. I need to go. But um I think for next class, who am I? I'm spending too much time in school. For next book club,
Sorry, Professor.
23-year-old professor. No, for next book club, for next meeting, let's try and tackle books 1 and 2. Is that reasonable? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Let's tackle books 1 and 2 next week, same time, and I'll make sure that our friend, yeah, I'll see you guys next week.